Okay, so thanks, Lee, for your introduction. Pretty much what Lee said. I'm going to talk about React Final Form, and specifically the problems I found with it and what it helps as well. Oh, okay. So like Lee said, I'm Reen. I'm a software developer at Redspace, and I went to NSCC Truro for IT web development, and I'm interested in data science and backend capabilities. So I've done a lot of projects in Node, and I'm interested in GraphQL and pretty much state management and handling state and fetching data and stuff like that. So this is my overview for my talk. I'm going to talk about what is Final Form and what is React Final Form. And then kind of dive into using third-party components with React Final Form and use some examples from the React Final Form docs as a bit of a demo. I had a demo as well, but mine has decided to stop working. I had an exhaustive depths issue, which is always a good time. So we might pull mine out and just like take a look at my code as well, but it's very similar to the third-party components from the doc. So it's, yeah. Okay, so what is Final Form? It's created by Eric Rasmussen, which is this guy right here. What a guy. Very great picture of him, obviously. It's a framework agnostic, high performance, subscription-based form state management, which is a lot of words. Basically means he tried to boil it down to simple JavaScript that can have any kind of framework wrapper, really focus on performance and subscription-based, so it only re-renders when it absolutely needs to and when specific parameters change, and you can set those parameters so the form doesn't constantly re-render on every change. Rasmussen also created Redux Form, and he kind of took a lot of the pitfalls that he found in that library and kind of put them all together and gathered all the complaints and also the features, I guess, as well, because at the end of the day, Redux Form was also a state management form library. And then he considers Final Form an evolution of Redux Form. And yeah, that's pretty much it. That I was listening to quite a few podcasts about his decision to go from Redux Form to Final Form. And one of the biggest reasons he decided to was the bundle size. He talks about, and I linked the podcast at the end of my presentation, but he talks about how he kind of, Redux Form was the first time he ever created an open source library or open source anything really. And so people kind of kept just messaging him saying like, oh, you should add this feature and you should add this feature. And and then he kind of felt like he couldn't say no at that point. So the bundle size got huge and people complained about it, and which is fair. So in React, or Final Form rather, he really wanted to modularize it and have zero dependencies and keep the bundle size as small as possible. But that comes at a cost too, and we can talk about that a little bit later. So what is React Final Form? It's a wrapper for Final Form written by Eric Rasmussen and hooks compatible. So basically, his idea was to boil it down to simple JavaScript and have developers write their own wrapper. He loves React and like only really wants to write React. So he wrote the React one, but there's like a Vue one as well and some other wrappers that he didn't personally write, but he allows developers to kind of add it in there. But obviously, I'm sure it goes through like a approval process and stuff like that. So basically, and this kind of gets into my third third-party kind of stuff. But what you need to make a form in React Final Form is just provide an onset submit prop, provide a way to render the form, and then do something with handle submit. And it seems like it's not super complicated, but the only thing with this React Final Form is that it tends to get very complicated very quickly. So I'm just going to read a little bit about each of those three little elements. OnSubmit is a function that we called with the values of your form and the user submits form, obviously, and all validation passes. So it will auto validate the form like on like field level validation and also on submit. Yeah, so basically they want you to use the render function as opposed to like passing in a component to a form, and this will make a lot more sense when we go into the examples, but with it being simple JavaScript, you kind of have to follow some rules in order for it to work properly and the way you want it to. So yeah, forms suck and we all hate doing them and we all have to do them. So this is kind of a trade-off for like, I will handle all the state for you, but you have to follow all these kind of rules for you to do that. And I'm gonna start looking at some examples, just opening the docs here. Here, sorry, I thought, can you see my like Chrome window still, or is it just my?
We can see the code sandbox.
Oh, okay, cool. So this is they all look the same. Yeah. So this is just the React Final Form docs. Kind of like what I was talking about before. They talk about it being modularized and zero dependencies and high performance and stuff like that. So I'll just walk through the simple example really quickly and then kind of dive into it from there. So kind of what I was talking about just a few minutes ago with having the ability to have an onSubmit, a render, and do something with handle submit. So right here is like the React Final Form, and they have, you pass it in onSubmit, so like you get to decide what the actual onSubmit function is, and this just has initial values. You don't always have to have initial values. And then, yeah, this render function is pretty much the most important part to it. So you pass handle submit, which is kind of confusing because it's called handle submit, but then you have an on submit here. But basically it just points your on submit function to this handle submit, but it's like Rasmussen's terminology for that specific thing. And I'm sure there's a reason for calling it handle submit. It also comes with like a form from the form API, and that lets you do specific API things like resetting your form and stuff like that, where it would have to kind of go into the DOM. I'm pretty sure he uses useRef in that kind of area. Not 100% sure though. And then just like your normal kind of submitting things and the values that are being passed down to the form. So every time you, yeah, okay, I was gonna see. Every time you like start typing in here, I put my last name as my first name, but that's great. So all these values here, it's being passed down from the fields, the field component here, to the form itself. So every single time it is doing that. Yeah, and then so this is like kind of the non-subscription based form element. So it is re-rendering every time it changes. And then, yeah, so I'll show you that one in a second. But this is just like the field component. It supports input, select, and text area, like normal components. And you put that as just a string. But as we'll see, you can use like like any kind of component, like a third-party component. But it all really boils down to inputs with a type and stuff like that. Everything else is kind of like your basic form stuff. It's just that under the hood, everything's being handled for you, even like validation and stuff like that. Okay, this one doesn't have validation. Okay, of course. But basically, let's see if it does it when okay. So we'll take a look at the validation next. Sorry. Yes, so basically this is just the validation. And this is pretty much what we just saw before, except for there's this little validate function. So basically just like if it's touched, basically like that, it'll be required. And then, so that's just like record level. So as it's inputting the value, it's like, as it's checking the value, it will throw back the error. And it shows it right here, this little meta.error, meta.touch. So each input, you can access the input itself and the metadata of that input by just using this little render function that comes with the field component. And yeah, it makes it much easier to handle validation, but it also kind of makes it difficult to handle it at the same time because you're not really touching how it gets the data and stuff like that. And then the other kind of, sorry, there's just so many windows open. The field level validation. So basically this, instead of having the validate function on the form itself, which you can have both, and I think the validate function on the form would be run on submit, but this one would be on submit and record level, so as it's inputting the values, but this is like as you're, as soon as it gets the value, it checks to see this little validator essentially, and you get to decide or write your own function to do to validate essentially. So they wrote this little const required value, and basically if it's undefined, we're going to just say it's required. Yeah, that's pretty much it. The cool part about this is that, I'll show you this example here. This little validate, but then they have multiple validators, so they have it be with the ability to run through it being required. It must be a number and it being a min value. And under the hood, sorry, I'm just trying to find those validators. Under the hood, that is kind of, they set, and also I haven't really read the code, but from what I can tell and from what I've used and had to use for this, essentially like a use state errors, and then it's just returning the errors for you instead of you actually having to like pay attention to the errors yourself. You're just setting what the errors, like what you want the errors to be, essentially, which is really nice. And this is my first really large library for forms in React, so I'm not sure if there's other ones that do something exactly the same or something similar. But that's the nice part about it for sure. Cool. That's really all the validation, and go back to the docs really quickly. Cool. So let's talk about the subscription levels. So as you can see here, they give like a pretty cool example of their performance optimization through subscriptions. So basically, yeah, like in the example, the number of circles are the times the component has been rendered, and the top form doesn't have a subscription attached, so it will render every time it changes. So like every time I touch it, every time it goes like that. and then the bottom form subscribes to the actual field that needs to be changed. So this one, I believe it renders just because it's been like updated, or not updated, but touched. So like this will still do it, but then this is the only value that's actually changing. So you're subscribing to the value changed as opposed to the field actually existing and being in the DOM essentially, and just being part of the form. So if we kind of dive into the code a little bit for this, a lot of this stuff is kind of the same. It has like the onsubmits render function, stuff like that. The only thing that's changing is adding this little subscription property here. And it's pretty crazy that it is just that easy, that you either, you just pass it a subscription and it'll kind of handle it for you. So right here, when you say like my form, adding the component to your content here, here's obviously without the subscription, and then right here we get to say like what values we want to be, or properties rather, we want to be subscribing to. So submitting and pristine. So I only want to subscribe to it once they're about to submit the form and when it's pristine, meaning there's no errors. So that's obviously good because it's not subscribing to all the value changes that happen when they're consistently entering like wrong data or they have to check something. So the thing with that is that you have to kind of rely on the like the field level validations. So that kind of gets tricky, and I've had this issue on one of our projects here. It's an admin panel, so it creates accounts, and basically the account email, we had to check the database if that account already existed. So we had to subscribe to that like call essentially, and then validate it. So it gets a little complicated for sure, and I think that there's room for improvement for that. Just because, yeah, like when you're doing that fetch, like within like submitting or pre-submitting, and there are like properties you can have for the fields like pre-submit and stuff like that, but it's not quite there where it's doing it instantaneously or as the person is like typing it in or something like that, and it requires a lot of custom handling, pretty much. So yeah, that's pretty cool stuff. The next part I wanted to talk about was kind of, I mean, I could talk about quickly just the regular props for the form and field really quickly, because like I said, there are more props that I didn't really mention yet. So yeah, there's an on-submit prop, obviously the render component or children. They recommend using render because the component and children could affect the way that React DOM renders the elements. So yeah, it's kind of silly. And I'm sure there's reasons why they had to do use children or use components, stuff like that. And then yeah, just a pretty simple like on submit. And then the fields are a bit more interesting. We kind of talked about the fact that you could add a component with the input select or text area just as a string, or you could use React.component type. So we'll talk about a little bit more about that when we start talking about third-party components. Fields also have their own render function, and that was when we were looking at the little input and meta fields. And that basically like allows you to like render of the field actually grab the data. So like you can get input.name and meta.error and do your own validation. A lot of people use like a separate error component and kind of just pass the input and metadata into there. It's pretty cool. So that's pretty much it. That I was going to talk about for that. And then, yeah, custom inputs. So what they say here is that the only thing a custom input actually technically needs is a name, a value, and an onChange function. So if we start looking at, and this is kind of my one downside with React Final Form 2, there's not a ton of documentation on these specific like UI things that you can use. So that they use Smooth UI, for example, here, and I've honestly never heard of it. I'm sure people have, but it's not something I would use normally. And in our project too, we were using React Bootstrap, and it took me like a solid 2 days to figure it out. And also this documentation didn't exist for when I was actually doing it. I found like someone had like a similar issue online and stuff like that. But the good thing about Rasmussen is that he is very, very good at kind of listening to people's complaints and also using people's solutions. So that's pretty cool. And he kind of is easily able to add it to the library. Cool. So this is, yes, obviously Smooth UI. And they have little UI modulars and stuff like that. And like this stuff is all just very the same. It's just an onSubmit function. And yeah, literally this is where all the magic happens. So basically they have this function that returns a field component, but using the component from the UI library and then kind of wrapping it into something that React Final Form can actually use. So right here, you kind of declare the kinds of inputs that exist on the form. So, or the specific page you're working on here. So obviously adapted input, you know, it's just a regular input, but it's meant to look like the Smooth UI. And what you have to pass it is just the input and then the meta. They're using valid here just because they're using their own error component, but you could just pass the entire meta stuff and that's fine. And then, yeah, all you do is just like return the component with the input and the rest, which is like if it has children or if it has like a render function attached to it. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the inputs. The difficult part was that, well, I guess it took me a while to realize that the input kind of comes with an onChange function because I was kind of not understanding how it actually got the value, but obviously since we're passing the entire input in, it has like all of those values in it, like on blur, on change. And that is something that you can actually use if you wanted to do something different with an on change value or like on blur. So there is flexibility in that way. So that's kind of what I was just mentioning, the little error thing. Basically, it's just a field within the form. You pass it the input name, and it subscribes to if the input has an error and if it's touched. So that's super cool. So instead of actually doing something like in this little adapt function and checking to see if the input actually has an error or it has been touched, or if it's like pristine or like dirty since last submit, there's quite a few properties you can check out. But instead of doing that, you can just subscribe to it right away and don't have to worry about just kind of a lot of like input dot whatever, meta dot error dot whatever. So this kind of handles it all for you, and it's quite nice. And also you're able to use the UI for it. So that's awesome. Other than that, that's just kind of pretty much the same stuff. Yeah. Yeah. So basically, my griefs with third-party components with React is that it can get convoluted, and only official documentation really focuses on Chakra and Smooth UI. That's not to say that there isn't documentation on other ones. It's just more of like Material UI. And if you're trying to kind of use this library in a existing project that might not use these specific UIs or uses a completely different one, it might be a little bit hard and require you to have custom stuff. Though this library has gotten better and has added more stuff since I first started using it. Like I said before, the documentation didn't even include those UI examples. So that's been really cool. And then the other thing is the final form boils down to simple JS, making React final form or other wrappers needing quite a bit of customization and thought to work. So like I was saying before, I haven't really found proper documentation and or people that have found a working and not convoluted solution to handle the fetching as soon as they kind of enter an email or something like that to check the database for. So okay, yeah, so that was pretty much all I had for that. I know I kind of just like went through the documentation, but I'm feel free to ask me some questions about it. I'm sure I'll be a bit more direct with it, just because there's a lot to talk about once you kind of get into React Final Form. But yeah. And also, I'm available on Slack and email and stuff like that. So you can just ask me any questions from there. Hopefully, it was good.
That's awesome. Thanks. Yeah, that's really cool. I really like how they're going to the subscription route for things like this, and we're seeing that a lot more, kind of with this, and we're seeing it with Recoil that kind of just came out as experimental for state management. They kind of have this higher use ref that where it doesn't cause any updates to the store. It can only we're only subscribing at this lower level, which is making our React apps a lot more efficient and faster.
Definitely. And also like the fact that this is so like self-sustaining, like the only thing that the state, you just need the one component. You don't need app to know that the form component has been changed. Like there's no kind of connection there that needs to happen, which is really nice. Or necessarily, obviously, but yeah.
One question I had for you, I noticed that you were using a lot of render props API throughout it. I also noticed when you're going through the documentation, there was a lot of hooks examples. Do you know if the hooks API that they have, does it fully support everything we need to do, or do we still have to use render props API for some solutions?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. So from what I can tell, you can't use so if you're looking at the docs here, you can't use like use field and use form natively. Like you can't just straight up call use form and like pass it all the props and it builds this form for you. You still need to use like the form component and stuff like that. But I think they only include it because they use it under the hood. And I guess people were wanting to know like what they actually use. But yeah, from what I can tell and from my kind of using this library, you can't use them yet. And because I would love to do that too. I think that would be awesome just to pass it right along as props and not have to really be bogged down by a component necessarily. So
yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. I think it'll go that way though. I really do. I think they're gonna get there.
Yeah, if not, we might have to, jump in and help them out with some open source.
Honestly, yeah, for sure. Yeah, he seems like a cool dude. So
sure. That's awesome.
Yeah.
It looks eerily similar to even the.
Sorry, I don't know if someone had a question and I just can't.
Oh, I don't know if you guys can hear me well. I said it looks like eerily similar to like Formic by Jared.
Yeah.
Like even though it's like use field, use form, and the fact that it has field components, like it looks like they took a lot of inspiration from that API and then just kind of used some refs under the hood to help.
Yeah, to make it feel a bit more React-y.
Yeah.
I haven't used Formic personally, but I've took a look, and I think we were going to use Formic on our project and decided to use React Final Form, and I think, I could be wrong, but the deciding factor was bundle size. It was quite a heavy code base already, and we didn't want to be adding something crazy, especially when it was just a couple of small modal forms. So it's a good point, though. It is very, very similar. And I mean, at some point, form libraries are all kind of boiling down to the same thing and wanting to do the same thing too. So
Awesome. Were there any more questions for Rin before we pass it off to KG? Looks like we have a question in the comments. Are there any performance benefits related with using Final Form as compared to using use effect hooks for subscription models?
So I think the answer is that's what it's doing. So if you were using a use effect on, I'm not sure if I understand you. So are you saying like instead of using that, or?
Are there any performance benefits related with using Final Form as compared to using use effects hooks for subscription models? I mean, based on the question, I think behind the scenes they are using use effects and use ref to kind of do this. So essentially, I think React Final Form is doing the same thing that you would be able to implement on your own, except that it's doing it for you. So,
exactly. And the distinction between Final Form and React Final Form, because Final Form is just straight up JavaScript, and then React is just kind of using the coolness of React to do a lot of the performance enhancements that React comes with, just for you, essentially.
So on the performance side of things, I think they would be pretty much the same. It's just that it would be a lot more work to implement it with the React Final Form.
Just quickly, if I look on bundle phobia, it says that React Final Form is about 79% smaller than Formic.
Well, there you go.
There you go.
Nice.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Awesome. So I don't think there's any more questions. So thanks so much, Rin.
Thank you. It was
Great job.
Great. Thanks.
We're going to pass it over to Kate.